Good evening and welcome to All About Money. I'm your host, Dhruv Tigekar, and today we're returning to the subject of space. Why? Well, earlier this month, Russia carried out a test of its anti-satellite missile system. It did this by destroying one of its own satellites, causing outrage in the international community and fears of possible damage to orbital stations like the ISS. It's also got experts worried about the growing amount of debris in space around Earth, as it's thought some 10,000 tons of just hardware is floating around from decades of space flights and missions. Well, joining me from the U.S. to talk about this is Akhil Rao. He's an assistant professor of economics at Middlebury College, and he's also led a paper on the economic costs of floating space debris, as well as how a tax on orbiting satellites could help address that problem. Akhil, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Before we get around to the solution that you've proposed in your research, I did want to get a sense of the economic scale of this problem. Is there any way to gauge, or are there any current economic models in place to gauge just how costly the space debris can potentially be?
Yeah, so before I get into any kind of numbers, and all the numbers that we have at the moment are pretty rough, I should say, let me try to sketch out broadly the conceptual framework for thinking about these costs. So space debris can be pretty costly to satellite operators, directly and indirectly, due to collisions and fragmentation. This is, of course, excluding the cost of human life with folks on the ISS, as you mentioned. So satellites can cost anywhere from thousands to hundreds of millions of dollars. And the direct cost of a collision with some space debris would include the foregone value generated from that satellite. For commercial operators, these would be revenues, as well as the cost of replacing the asset, assuming that it is to be replaced. So these collisions then generate lots of small fragments. Those fragments can themselves cause more collisions. So the indirect cost of a collision should include the expected costs of additional collisions induced down the line. We economists call these the marginal external costs of a satellite. These are the incremental costs that one actor imposes on another through their actions. And so there are a number of metrics that folks are developing to gauge the extent of the problem. The simplest is just to calculate the probability of a collision. There are some indices which take this a step further and include some of these fragmentation consequences from a collision. And then there are other approaches that take sort of a focus on the sustainability of a spacecraft across its life and assign a rating for that. So I view all of these as ways to approximate the marginal external cost of a satellite. In that paper that you mentioned, we tried to calculate this. It's a very rough estimate using very aggregated numbers. And we got a number on the order of about $15,000 per satellite per year right about now.
And I mean, there has been growing movement around removing this debris from space. There have been the solutions from everything from nets to lasers to kind of rein in this debris. But you've actually said in your paper that this might not be the ideal approach. Instead you've recommended an incentive-based solution. Why is that? What makes that more effective than a technological-based solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, let me say that technological solutions are going to be essential to cleaning up orbital space and maintaining sustainable orbits. We need the ability to take stuff down and reduce the risk of collisions. Technology solutions like the nets, the lasers that you talked about, these kinds of things enable these capabilities. And so they're critical for long-term sustainability. But technology alone isn't going to solve the problem, because the core of the problem here is incentives. When I launch a satellite, I am for sure going to account for risks to my own satellite. This is a costly asset that I'm putting in orbit. I want to make sure that this thing can deliver returns. But I may or may not account for the risk that my satellite poses to other folks, directly and indirectly, during and after its operational life. And in fact, the more competitive the market I'm operating in is, the greater the incentive I face to ignore these additional risks that are imposed on others because they don't affect my bottom line. And that's a huge problem. So technological solutions that remove debris or harden satellites against collisions, they don't really address this incentive. In fact, by cleaning up orbital space without imposing any additional costs on the operators, they're creating new incentives to launch more satellites. So for example, if satellite operators are willing to tolerate, let's say, I'm making this number up, a 0.1% collision risk, and debris removal cuts the existing collision risk in orbit in half, we should expect profit-driven operators to seize this opportunity, to see the money on the table and take it, and launch new satellites until the risk is pushed back up towards that 0.1% tolerance. So, to give you an analogy here, think about adding a lane to a really busy highway with the goal of reducing traffic congestion. Initially, yeah, maybe it does reduce congestion as the current users have more room to use. But eventually, there's going to be some folks who weren't using the road because it was so congested. They're going to look at this road and they're going to think, hey, traffic isn't so bad there. Maybe I'll take that road. And in the end, traffic congestion isn't going to fall as much as the planners had hoped for. So economists call this a rebound effect. And this is something to watch out for with these technological solutions.
And just staying with that road analogy for a second, what would be the equivalent of this incentive-based solution in that case?
So the equivalent would be congestion pricing for a roadway. So you say that, look, if you want to use the road at a certain time of day, we're going to charge you a fee for using specific segments, or a sort of a continuous fee as long as your car is on the road for using it. And that fee is going to adjust based on how congested the road is to try to get users to account for those external costs. Everybody loves to say that I hate traffic, but when you're on the road, to everybody else there, you are traffic.
Right. And you know, going back to the findings in this paper, you've recommended that these incentives target objects in space and not, in fact, the launches themselves, which some might see as a one-time fee versus what you've described as marginal external costs. When I asked you the first question in our interview. So I did want to sort of clarify. If the satellite were destroyed, say, for example, in orbit, would the company bear the cost of each piece of debris? How would that work?
Yeah, so this is a great question. There's a couple ways that you could think about this. So one is that you could say, if the satellite is destroyed under existing international law, the company that launched the satellite still owns those fragments. Those are still objects in space. Those are still imposing marginal external cost. They should still be charged for that. Now, this is where technologies become critical. If the company goes bankrupt or is unable to remove those objects, that seems like a pretty unpleasant outcome for the company. They're just stuck with this fee liability into perpetuity. Technologies can help address that.
And speaking of the findings that you have come across as well, you've recommended obviously an orbital use fee, which is something that we haven't really come across so far in any kind of research regarding space costs. How would you explain the system to our viewers and how you structured it?
Yeah, so I mean, I would explain this, I think, with congestion pricing analogies. I think that's a useful way to think about this.
Right.
Another way to think about this is with parks, public parks. Here in the US, at least, we have a lot of public parks. These are kind of open to all. But when you go to use the park, you pay a small fee. That fee goes towards maintenance of the park. Now, that's to account for the fact that all the folks who are using the park, even if they're on their best behavior, are going to be causing some amount of trail degradation. You're going to be kind of disturbing the local area a little bit. That fee just helps keep the park nice for everybody to use. An orbital use fee is kind of like that. It helps keep orbital space nice for everybody to use.
And just in terms of analogies, we're going back to that again. You've compared the costs and losses sustained by the space industry to the fisheries and the oil sector here, especially in the U.S. What are some of the similarities that you've noticed that would likely come to pass in the space industry?
Yeah, so two of my co-authors on this paper, Dan Caffine and Matt Burgess, they've thought a lot about fisheries. And as we were discussing this problem, the analogy seemed very clear, namely that both settings, orbit use and fisheries, suffer from something that economists call an open access problem. Open access is a situation where if I want to go and use the resource, I can just go and use the resource. Now, this is not true for some fisheries that are nationally regulated or within exclusive economic zones, but for high seas fisheries that are outside of territorial waters and not regulated in this way, this is very much the case. If I want to go fish out in the high seas, I can do it. Anyone who can hop in a boat and do it can do it. And so fish populations in those areas are going to suffer under that kind of institutional management. Fishers who behave responsibly are going to find themselves leaving money on the table, and the folks who are being less responsible are going to claim that money. Now, that's not a great set of incentives, and we see similar incentives in space. To the extent that a company is going to behave responsibly, for example, by limiting the number of satellites they launch or by incurring extra costs to themselves to dispose of their satellite more responsibly, to harden their satellites against collisions, they're ceding some profits, at least in the near term, to their potential competitors who are behaving a little bit less responsibly.
So
So
in a sense, it's almost an opportunity cost of year.
yeah, exactly. If you see a $20 bill on the ground, and if you don't pick it up, somebody else is probably going to pick it up. And so either you pick it up or someone else does, but in the long run, it's not going to be left on the ground.
And in terms of, I guess, the competition aspect of it, how much do you think the fees that you recommended would impact that specifically?
Yeah, so this is one of the tough things, I think, with managing these kinds of resources. These kinds of fees are likely going to have some effects on competition. It's entirely plausible that larger firms are going to be better able to bear these costs
Right.
than smaller firms. Now, before we conclude then that these fees would make the industry less competitive, we have to keep in mind what's the counterfactual here? What happens in the absence of these fees? So imagine a world in which orbital space is quite cluttered and it's very hard to keep satellites up there. Companies that are very large that can afford to keep launching more satellites are probably going to have a much better run of the market than companies that are small and can't afford to keep bearing those replacement costs. So it's not obvious what is going to happen to competition relative to a plausible baseline in which we do nothing.
Akhil, we do have to go to a quick break, but do stay with us. We'll be right back.